The Mississippi River does not give things back. This is what the people who live along its banks understand before they understand most other things, before they understand commerce or politics or the specific cruelties and kindnesses of the human world. The river takes. It takes boats and cargo and seasons and sometimes lives, and what it takes it keeps, pulling everything down into its dark moving interior where the current is a law unto itself, and the bottom is a place that daylight has never reached. The people of Harrowfield, Mississippi knew this the way they knew the smell of the river in the morning and the sound of it at night, as a fact so fundamental that it required no discussion, only the particular respect that fundamental facts receive from people who live close enough to them to know better than to forget them. Which is why what happened to Timothy Caldwell in the autumn of 1867 was not, for the people of Harrowfield, simply a medical event or a fortunate accident, or even a miracle in the ordinary religious sense of that word. It was something that did not fit inside any of the categories available to them, because the river had taken Timothy Caldwell. And then, 11 minutes later, by the account of the men who pulled him from the water, it had given him back. And the boy who came back was not, in any way that the people who loved him most could entirely explain or entirely accept, the same boy the river had taken. His mother knew it first. Of course she did. Mothers always know first and most completely and most painfully, because the knowing comes not from observation, but from the cellular level of a woman who has been connected to another person, since before that person had a heartbeat separate from her own. Eleanor Caldwell knew in the first moment she saw her son's face after they carried him onto the riverbank and laid him on the mud and worked over him with the desperate, unscientific urgency of men who do not know what they are doing but are doing everything they can. She knew when his eyes opened and he looked up at the circle of faces above him with an expression that was not the expression she expected, not relief or fear, or the ordinary confusion of a child returning to consciousness after something terrible. It was something else, something steadier and more distant and more specific than any of those things, the expression of a person who has been somewhere and has returned and is still, in some part of themselves, in the place they have been. She had pushed through the circle of men and knelt in the mud beside him and taken his face in both her hands and said his name, Timothy, Timothy, and he had looked at her with those steady, distant eyes and said, in a voice that was his voice, and yet subtly altered in its quality, the way a musical note is altered when the same note is played on a different instrument, that he was all right. He said it with a certainty that was not the certainty of a 9-year-old child who has just been pulled half-drowned from the Mississippi River. It was the certainty of someone who has assessed their own condition from a position of unusual clarity and found it to be as described. Eleanor pressed her forehead to his and held his face and wept, because she was his mother and he was alive, and the weeping was the only adequate response to that. But underneath the weeping, underneath the relief and the gratitude and the physical, shaking joy of a woman who has just had her child returned to her from a place she had already, in the 11 minutes of his absence, begun to understand he was not coming back from, underneath all of that was something else, something quiet and specific and very frightening, a recognition. The boy in her hands was Timothy. His face was Timothy's face, and his hands were Timothy's hands, and his voice was Timothy's voice, mostly, nearly, in all the ways that would be visible to anyone who had not known him as completely as she had known him since the moment he was born. But underneath the face and the hands and the voice, in the place where a mother's knowing lives, in the part of her that was connected to him before either of them had words for the connection, something was different. Something had changed. Something had been in the river that should not have been in the river, and something had come back with the body of her son that had not gone in with it, and she did not have a name for what that something was, and she did not know what to do with the not having a name for it. And so she held him in the mud on the bank of the Mississippi River, and wept and said his name, and let the not knowing be inside her alongside the relief, because she was his mother and the loving of him did not require the understanding of him. And whatever he was now, he was still here, and here was enough. His name was Timothy James Caldwell. He had been born on the 14th of March, 1858, in the upper room of the Caldwell house on the eastern edge of Harrowfield, the second child of Eleanor and Robert Caldwell, and the one who had, from his first hours, been the easier of the two to be with in the specific way that certain children are easier to be with, not demanding and not anxious, present in a room without requiring the room to organize itself around him, curious in the uncomplicated way of a child, who finds the world genuinely interesting rather than threatening. His sister Clara, 3 years older, had been the one who talked and laughed and filled spaces with her personality. Timothy had been the one who watched and thought, and occasionally said something that made the adults around him look at each other with the specific expression of adults who have been surprised by a child's perception. He had been 9 years old and entirely himself on the morning of the 17th of September, 1867, when he had gone to the river with 3 other boys from the neighborhood and had fallen from the old wooden dock on the southern edge of the waterfront, the dock that was known to be unsafe, and that the children of Harrowfield used precisely because its unsafeness made it interesting. The specific logic of children who have not yet fully understood what the Mississippi River takes and keeps. The fall had not been dramatic. The dock plank had given way under him, and he had gone in without ceremony, without a shout, just gone. And the current had taken him in the way the current takes things, efficiently and without malice. And the other boys had run for the men on the working dock to the north, and the men had come and found him and pulled him out. And he had been, by the account of every person present, entirely without signs of life for the 11 minutes between the fall and the moment when his chest had lurched, and he had drawn the first of the rough, tearing breaths that meant he was going to breathe again. 11 minutes. In 1867, in a Mississippi River town, with no medical equipment and no knowledge of resuscitation beyond the instinctive pressing of hands and the turning of the body and the practical desperation of men who refused to stop trying, 11 minutes without breath and without heartbeat was not a period from which a person returned. The physician who examined Timothy later that afternoon, a man named Dr. Harlan Oates, who had practiced in Harrowfield for 14 years, and who was a man of medical science in the sense that was available in 1867, which was to say a man of reasonable knowledge and absolute humility about the limits of that knowledge, told Robert Caldwell that he could not account for the boy's survival in any medical framework he had available. He said the boy's vital signs were normal. He said there was no apparent neurological damage that he could detect with the tools he had. He said he was going to write up the case for a medical journal in St. Louis because it was the most extraordinary thing he had seen in 14 years of practice. And he said he would be watching Timothy carefully in the weeks that followed, and that Robert and Eleanor should send for him immediately if anything seemed wrong. Eleanor did not tell Dr. Oates what she had seen in Timothy's eyes on the riverbank. She did not tell him because she could not have described it in terms that a man of medical science in 1867 would have received as a medical observation rather than a mother's overwrought imagination, and she was not willing to have what she had seen reduced to that. She kept it, in the way she had learned to keep the things that had no adequate category in the world of other people's understanding, inside herself, and she watched Timothy with the specific and comprehensive attention of a woman who has been given something back, and who is trying to understand what, exactly, has been given. The first thing she noticed was the silence. Not that Timothy had been loud before. He had always been a quiet child. But the quality of his silence after the river was different from the quality of his silence before it. Before, his silence had been the silence of a child who is thinking, warm and interior and occasionally interrupted by whatever the thinking had produced. After, his silence had a quality she could not immediately name, a quality of something that has been very far away and has returned, but has not entirely closed the distance. The silence of a person who is present in a room, and also, in some part of themselves, somewhere else. The second thing she noticed was the knowing. It began small. 2 days after Timothy came home from the river, he told her that the Henderson house on the western end of the street was going to catch fire. He said it in the matter-of-fact way he said most things now, without drama and without particular emphasis, as though he were reporting something he had observed rather than something he was predicting. She had looked at him and asked him why he thought that, and he had said he did not know why he thought it, only that he did. The Henderson house caught fire the following night, a chimney fire that the family managed to contain without major damage, but that was, by any measure, a fire. She told Robert. Robert was a man of practical temperament who had come through the war with the specific combination of pragmatism and exhaustion that the war produced in the men who survived it, and who managed most things by applying to them the most functional interpretation available. He said the Henderson chimney had been smoking badly for 2 weeks, and that any observant person in the neighborhood might have predicted a fire from it. She said Timothy had not been outside in the 2 days since he came home. Robert said he might have noticed it before he went in. She said perhaps. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that perhaps was not sufficient, and that she had seen his face when he said it, and he had not said it the way a child reports an observation. He had said it the way a child reports a knowledge. The third thing was the questions. Timothy began asking questions after the river that were not the questions of a 9-year-old child. They were not inappropriate questions, not frightening or disturbing in their content, but they had a quality of orientation to them, the quality of someone trying to establish where they are and what year it is, and who the people around them are. That was inconsistent with a child who had lived in Harrowfield his entire life and knew every person in his family and his neighborhood. He asked Alina in the first week how long she had lived in this house. He asked Robert what he did for work in a way that suggested he was not certain of the answer. He asked Clara, his sister, what her name was, and Clara had looked at him with the expression of a 12-year-old confronted with something she could not process, and had said, "My name is Clara Timothy. You know my name," and Timothy had said yes, he knew, he only wanted to hear her say it. Alina watched all of this and held all of it inside her and continued feeding him and getting him dressed in the mornings and sitting beside him at church and answering his questions when he asked them and asking Dr. Oates to come by twice in the first month. And Oates came and examined Timothy and found nothing medically wrong, found a healthy 9-year-old boy in full possession of his faculties, and told Alina she was experiencing the natural anxiety of a mother who had nearly lost her child, and advised rest and routine, and the passage of time. She did not tell Oates about the Henderson fire. She did not tell him about the questions. She kept those things in the place inside her where she kept the things that had no adequate category. And she watched Timothy with the patient, comprehensive attention of a woman who has understood that what has happened in her family is something that the available explanations are not equal to, and who has decided that the watching is what she has to offer in the absence of the understanding. Timothy was 15 when his father died, and he had already most of what he needed to be the person he was going to be. He had the steadiness that came from the river, and the knowing that came with it, and the judgment about when and how to use the knowing that had come from the years of watching it produce responses he had not intended. He had his mother, who had never required him to be anything other than what he was. He had Clara, who had accepted him without negotiation from the first. He had the town of Harrowfield, which was not always comfortable with him, but which was his and which he was, and the belonging to which was one of the things that had made the returning feel right in the moments when it had felt most uncertain. He grew up. He became a man of the river town in the way that river town men become, through the specific combination of the river's influence and the town's influence and the particular history of a post-Civil War Mississippi community that was still working out what it was now that the war had ended, and the Reconstruction had come, and the old order had shifted in ways that the new order had not yet entirely clarified. He worked for a time in the river trade, on the steamboats that were still the primary commercial arteries of the Mississippi, and he found on the river a quality of familiarity that was not entirely explained by the years of living beside it. A quality that he understood came from somewhere older than his current life, and that he did not try to explain more fully than that, because the fuller explanation was not one he was certain could be made in terms that the world he lived in had available. He married in 1879 a woman named Judith Hale, who had come to Harrowfield from Tennessee, and who was one of the people who had earned the sharing, not through any dramatic act of trust, but through the accumulated evidence of a relationship in which she had seen him in all his qualities, and had received each one with the same practical warmth that Clara had always given him. She knew about the river. He told her before he told her he loved her, which was the order he had decided on as a young man, because the telling and the loving were connected in a way that required the telling to come first. She had listened to all of it, and then she had said that she had known something was different about him from the first time she met him, that there was a quality to him that she had not been able to name, and that she was glad now to have the name for it, and that the name did not change anything she felt except to make it more specific, and specific was better than general for a feeling you intended to keep. Alina lived to see this. She lived to see Timothy married and settled, and becoming the person the river had begun to make him. And she sat at the wedding in the Harrowfield church with Clara beside her, and felt the specific fullness of a woman whose life has arrived at a place she was not always certain it would arrive at, the fullness that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the presence of the people you love in the continuing life that the difficulty made possible. She died in 1883 at the age of 63, in the upper room of the Caldwell house, where Timothy had been born and where Robert had died, and Timothy was with her at the end, sitting beside the bed, and holding her hand in the way he had held her hands at the kitchen table 16 years before, when he had told her what he remembered of the 11 minutes, and she had said that she was glad he was here, and that the gladness was sufficient for any understanding she required. She was not afraid at the end. This was what Timothy told Clara afterward, in the letter he wrote her that she kept for the rest of her life, and that her children found after she died, and that her grandchildren read and kept in turn. He said their mother had not been afraid, and that he had known she would not be because he had sat beside her in the last days, and the knowing had come to him not as a prediction, but as a recognition, the same kind of recognition he had felt standing on the riverbank 22 years before, looking at the river that had taken him and given him back, the recognition of something he had been somewhere near before and that he understood, without being able to explain the understanding, as well as it was possible to understand it. He said she had been entirely herself at the end, which was the most complete way he knew to say that she had died well. He said the last thing she had said to him, clearly and with the specific quality of a woman who has something precise to communicate and is making sure it is communicated accurately, was that she had always known he would be all right, not hoped, known. She had known it on the riverbank in the mud, and she had known it in the years that followed, and she had known it every day of his life since the river, with the maternal knowing that does not require explanation and does not diminish, and that lives in a place that is older than language, older than thought, in the part of a person that is connected to another person before either of them has words for the connection. She had known he would be all right, and he had been all right, in all the ways that all right can mean when applied to a person who is not the same person they were before the thing that changed them, which is to say in the deeper and more real and more hard-won ways rather than the simpler ones, in the ways that matter rather than the ways that are merely comfortable. Timothy Caldwell lived until 1889, dying at the age of 31 of a sudden illness that the Harrowfield physician could not fully account for, which was perhaps appropriate for a man whose life had contained from its most formative moment things that physicians could not fully account for. He left Judith and 2 children, a daughter named Alina after his mother and a son named Robert after his father. And he left them not only the ordinary inheritances of a man who has lived and worked and built something in his community, but the specific inheritance of a story that had no adequate category in any of the frameworks that 1867, or any subsequent year had made available. The story of the boy the river gave back. His daughter Alina grew up hearing it from her mother, who told it with the love and the precision of a woman who had heard it from the person it had happened to, and who understood that the telling of it was not a curiosity to be satisfied but a truth to be honored. Alina grew up and told it to her own children, and they told it to theirs, and the story moved forward through the generations in the way that the most important stories move, not unchanged but not distorted, retaining at its center the specific truth that it had always contained, which was not the truth of what the river had given Timothy, because that truth was not one that language had ever been entirely adequate to carry. The truth at the center of the story was a different one. It was the truth of a woman kneeling in the mud on a Mississippi riverbank with her son's face in her hands, saying his name, and understanding in the same moment both that he was changed and that he was here, and choosing, without hesitation and without the requirement of understanding, to let the here be enough. That was the truth. That was the thing worth carrying forward, that a mother's love does not require the understanding of its object to be complete, that the complete love is the one that holds what it cannot explain as faithfully as it holds what it can, that does not turn away from the changed thing, because it is changed, but moves toward it with the same arms that have always moved toward it, unchanged in their direction, even when the destination has shifted. Alina Caldwell had known this on the riverbank. She had known it every day of the 22 years she had been given afterward, and she had known it at the end in the upper room, holding her son's hand, with the maternal knowing that does not diminish and does not require explanation, and that is, of all the things a person can carry, the one most worth carrying. Robert's response to Timothy after the river was the response of a man who loves his son, and who has decided that the most useful thing he can do with the things he cannot explain is to not explain them. He treated Timothy with the careful normalcy of a man who has chosen normalcy as the strategy, who believes that if enough normalcy is applied to an abnormal situation, the situation will eventually conform to the normalcy, and who holds to this belief with the specific determination of a person who needs it to be true. He played checkers with Timothy in the evenings. He took him to the riverfront on Saturdays, which Alina found almost unbearably brave given what the riverfront was now. He read to him before bed. He did all the things a father does with his son, and he did them with a love that was completely genuine and a deliberateness that Alina could see, and that she knew was costing him something. And she loved him for the cost of it, even as she understood that it was not going to be sufficient. Clara was the one who dealt with Timothy most honestly, which was perhaps because she was 12 and had not yet acquired the adult habit of managing the unbearable through strategy. She dealt with it by simply being with him, which was the most honest thing available and also, it turned out, the most useful. She sat with him and talked to him and showed him things and told him things and treated him with the matter-of-fact warmth of a girl who has decided that her brother is her brother regardless of whatever else he is. And Timothy responded to her with a warmth and a directness that he did not always produce for the adults around him. He was, with Clara, most recognizably himself, or most recognizably the self he was now. Clara, Alina thought, might be the only person in the family who had simply accepted the self he was now without requiring it to be the self he had been before. The knowing continued. It did not escalate dramatically or become something that the family was unable to manage, but it continued as a quiet, persistent thread through the months after the river, appearing at intervals that were irregular enough to make the intervals feel like reprieves and regular enough to make clear that the reprieves were only intervals. He told Alina in November that her sister in Memphis was going to write with difficult news, and her sister wrote in December that her husband had lost his position, and they were in financial difficulty. He told Robert in January that the levee on the northern edge of the town needed attention before spring, and Robert dismissed this as a boy repeating waterfront conversation he had overheard. And in March, the northern levee showed a crack that the town's engineers said had they not found it early, could have caused serious flooding. He did not tell them how he knew these things. When asked, he said consistently, and without apparent frustration at the question, that he did not know how he knew, only that he did, and that the knowing came to him not as a thought that arrived in his mind, but as something more like a certainty that was simply present when he looked at a situation, the way you can look at the sky in the morning and know that rain is coming not from any specific observation, but from something your body understands before your mind has formulated it. Dr. Oates visited monthly through the first year. He found nothing. He wrote his article for the St. Louis Medical Journal and received 2 responses, one from a physician in Cincinnati who described a similar case from 1853, and one from a professor of neurology in Boston, who expressed polite skepticism about the factual basis of the case. Oates showed both responses to Robert and said that medicine was still very far from understanding what the brain does during and after extreme oxygen deprivation, and that he believed Timothy's survival was genuine and remarkable, and that the changes Eleanor and Robert described were likely a consequence of whatever had happened to the boy's neurological function during the 11 minutes, and that time and stability were the most appropriate responses. He said he would keep watching. Eleanor kept watching too. She watched with a love that did not diminish and did not simplify and did not ask Timothy to be something other than what he was, because she was his mother and the loving of him did not require the understanding of him. She had known this from the first night when she had held him in the mud on the riverbank, and she held to it through the months, and then the years that followed with the specific, determined faith of a woman who has decided that love does not need to understand its object in order to be complete. What she had not anticipated was the second thing the river had put in Timothy, the thing that was harder than the knowing and that took longer to surface, and that, when it surfaced, changed the shape of the family's life in ways that the knowing had not. Timothy remembered the river, not the fall and not the cold water and not the darkness of unconsciousness. He remembered something else, something that had happened in the 11 minutes, and he had been carrying the memory of it since the day he woke on the riverbank and looked up at his mother's face with those steady, distant eyes. He had been carrying it in the way that children carry things they have been given and do not yet know what to do with, and he carried it through the first year and into the second, and through the long, slow work of growing into the person he was becoming, which was a person who was Timothy Caldwell, and was also something more than Timothy Caldwell had been before the river, something layered and specific and quiet in the way of deep water that moves without showing its movement on its surface. He told Clara first. This was not surprising. Clara was the one he talked to most honestly, the one who had simply accepted him without requiring negotiation about what his acceptance required. He told her in the summer of 1869, 2 years after the river, sitting on the back step of the Caldwell house in the evening light, with the sound of the Mississippi somewhere behind the houses and the trees. He told her what he remembered of the 11 minutes, which was not a darkness and not a void, and not the absence of experience that an 1867 physician would have told him it should have been. What he remembered was a place, a quality of place rather than a specific geography, that had the quality of somewhere very far away and also somehow very close, as though far and close were not the opposites they seemed to be in the ordinary world. He said it had not been frightening. He said the only frightening part had been the coming back, the returning to the weight and the cold and the difficulty of the body after being somewhere that had none of those things. He said he had not wanted to come back and that the not wanting had frightened him more than anything else about it, because he was 9 years old and he loved his mother and he loved Clara, and he did not want to come back to them. And yet the not wanting had been there, clear and specific, in the first moments of his return. Clara sat with this for a long time. She was 14 years old and she was not a girl who was easily frightened, but she was a girl who understood the weight of what she had just been told. She said, did it still feel that way? Did he still not want to be here? And he said no. It did not still feel that way. that the feeling had belonged to the moment of the return and had faded as the returning became more complete, and as the world he had returned to had reasserted itself as the world worth being in. He said he was glad to be here. He said he was glad Clara was here, and that their mother was here, and that Robert was here. He said the only thing he carried from it now was the knowing, which was not a burden in the way that burdens usually are. It was simply a quality he had now that he had not had before. The way a person who has been through something difficult carries a particular kind of knowledge in their body afterward that did not come from books or teaching, but from the experience itself. Clara told Eleanor. She came to Eleanor the following morning and told her what Timothy had said, all of it, without omission, because she was her mother's daughter, and she understood that the telling was what the situation required. Eleanor sat in the kitchen and listened to all of it, and when Clara was finished she sat for a long time without speaking, and then she said she was glad he had told Clara, and she was glad Clara had told her, and she asked Clara to tell Timothy that he could tell her too, whenever he was ready, that she wanted to hear it from him when he was ready to say it. Timothy came to her the following Sunday. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, which was where the Caldwells conducted the serious conversations of their family life, and he told her what he had told Clara, again without omission, and in the same matter-of-fact way he told most things, the way of someone reporting experience rather than seeking a response to it. She listened with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on his face, and the full attention she had always given him. And when he was finished, she reached across and took both his hands in hers and held them, and said that she was glad he was here, that she had never been more glad of anything in her entire life than she was every morning that he was in this house, and that whatever the river had given him, she did not need to understand it in order to be grateful for it, because what it had given her was him, still here, still her son, and that was sufficient for any understanding she required. Timothy looked at her with the eyes that had been steady and distant on the riverbank, and that were now, 2 years on, something warmer and more present. The eyes of a boy who has been in a place that has no name and has come back and has found in the coming back that the place he came back to was worth coming back to. He said he knew. He said he had always known she felt that way even before he could have explained how he knew, and that the knowing of it had been, in the 2 years since the river, the thing that had made the returning feel most right. She held his hands across the kitchen table and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else to say that was more complete than what had already been said, and the completeness of it was the kind that does not need addition. The years that followed were the years of Timothy Caldwell becoming. He grew through his adolescence in Harrowfield with the specific quality he had brought back from the river, the steadiness and the distance and the occasional knowing, and the town grew used to him in the way that small towns grow used to their unusual members, which is to say not entirely and not without discomfort, but with the practical accommodation of people who have decided that the unusual member is part of the community's fabric, and that the fabric is what it is. He was Timothy Caldwell, the boy the river gave back, and Harrowfield knew what that meant even when it could not entirely say what it meant, which was the condition of most true things. He did not speak of the knowing publicly. He had learned, through the careful observation of how adults responded to it in the first years, that the public acknowledgement of the knowing produced two categories of response, neither of which was useful. The first was the response of people who wanted to use it, who came with questions about their businesses and their health and their futures, and who treated him as an instrument of practical advantage rather than as a person, and whose interest in him was exactly as warm as the information he could provide and no warmer. The second was the response of people who feared it, who found the knowing a disruption to their understanding of how the world worked, and who expressed their disruption in the specific ways that people in 1867 Mississippi expressed disruption, in whispers and in distance, and in the particular religious vocabulary of a community that had a well-worn framework for things that should not be possible, and that were. He kept it private. He shared it with his family and with a small number of people who had earned the sharing through the specific quality of their relationship with him. And he applied it, when it came, with the careful judgment of someone who understands that information given to the wrong person at the wrong time does more harm than the withholding of it. He was not always right about this. He was sometimes wrong in the way that all human judgments are sometimes wrong, and the wrongness cost him in ways that the rightness did not always compensate for. He lived with this as he lived with everything that came from the river, with the acceptance of a person who has been somewhere that has given him a particular perspective on cost and compensation, on what things are worth and what they are not. Robert Caldwell died in the summer of 1873, of the fever that moved through Harrowfield that season with the thoroughness of something that does not distinguish. He was 51 years old, and he died in the upper room of the house he had built, and in which his children had been born, and he died as he had lived after the river, with the careful normalcy of a man who has chosen normalcy as his strategy and who maintains it to the end. And the maintaining of it was, Aliner understood in the days after he was gone, the most loving thing he had ever done, because the normalcy had been what Timothy had needed to grow inside, the stable ground from which the unusual thing that Timothy was could develop, without being made into a spectacle or a burden or a problem to be solved. She said so at his graveside, not publicly, but in the private conversation she had with him in her own mind, while the minister said the words the minister was there to say. She said she understood what the normalcy had cost him and what it had been for, and that she was grateful for it, the way she was grateful for all things that are given freely without requiring recognition, which was completely and without condition.